Well, thank you all so much for having me. Can everyone hear me? Okay? Super. Thank you so much to Joan. I also just want to thank Hallie Swanson, Daniel Sutherland, Stephen Bartley, and Gretchen Welch in absentia for their consummate hospitality. It has been such a pleasure to be here and to walk Whistler's walks in Chelsea together. It's been just a pleasure. Also, of course, always and ever, Peter and Paula Lunder, who are the namesake of my position at the Smithsonian and who are so supportive of all things Whistler. So this evening, I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about an exhibition that we opened rather recently at the Freer Gallery called Ruffled Feathers, Creating Whistler's Peacock Room. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why I conceptualized the show the way I did, as well as the history of the room and how our collection is uniquely positioned to tell the story of this room in some new ways. So, next slide. And I'll say too, I'm offering this as a little taste, but this should, I hope, whet everyone's appetite to come and visit us post-haste in Washington, because I can guarantee that however enticing these images are, it is nothing like walking into this space. This space is magical. I do it very often, and it is equally entrancing every time. And it is really thanks to our museum's founder, Charles Lang Freer, who was a Detroit industrialist, that we have this very special space. It is also thanks to Charles Lang Freer that we have one of the premier collections of the work of James McNeill Whistler in the world. It is also thanks to Charles Lang Freer's will that I cannot travel anywhere, so I will say again, please come visit us, because it will offer you the opportunity to see these unparalleled works. So what you're seeing here are some glimpses of the most complete interior that Whistler ever created. For my money, I think it really reflects his artistic and aesthetic ambitions brought to light, and really during a time when he constructed it between 1876 and 77, that Whistler was really working through some of the meatiest issues of his artistic career. As you can see, from the wainscoting literally up to and including the ceiling, that's that top right panel, everything is decorated in this space. We have the shutters that you can see over here on the right in that installation view that show a variety of peacocks and their resplendent plumage. And then you have all of these different ways in which Whistler is then stylizing facets of the peacock, either the breast feathers or the tail feathers. You see him stylizing the eye of the peacock feather itself in various iterations across every visible surface of this space. You also will see here in the bottom right the gold shelving. That is the initial work of Thomas Jekyll, who was Frederick Leyland's original decorator, but the gilding is thanks to James McNeill Whistler. As we'll talk about a little bit, this was created to showcase Leyland's Conchi-era blue and white porcelain collection. As many of you likely know, this is also the site of one of the greatest melodramas of the 19th century. We have within the Peacock Room, and because of the Peacock Room, the story of a patron battling an artist who then immortalized the conflict in the mural that you're seeing here, called Art and Money, or the Story of the Room. This is a tussle, of course, over the extent of the changes that Whistler made to this space, as well as the exorbitant fee in Leyland's eyes that Whistler then charged for this unasked for work. I'll take a moment just to walk you through the visual spectacle here. So for those of you who know, Leyland was famous for his white ruff, that he is a stylistic affectation. Whistler, never one for subtlety, then visualizes this peacock here on the right with those special feathers up at his frill to give you a sense that this is Leyland. His body is made up, if you can see, of gold and silver coins that are actually dripping to the floor, so he is hoarding the money that Whistler believes is his due. We have Leyland as well as the peacock advancing menacingly, his plumage literally moving into the space of the retreating peacock here on the left. And for those of you, of course, who know Whistler's style, well, you know he had a famous shock of white hair, so you see here a retreating peacock over here on the left, also with that shock of white hair. So Whistler leaves for Leyland this visible marker of this very fractious relationship, this split, for Leyland to enjoy in perpetuity. So as you can see, it's a space of great beauty. It's also a space of enormous conflict. So every exhibition, I like to say, sort of starts with a problem that the curator is trying to solve. For me, it was that we know that this is, not surprisingly, the marquee attraction in our museum. When people come, they come asking where the Peacock Room is. And there is something so enveloping and encompassing about being in this space. I would be loath to ever put a text panel, because it is just an experience in its completeness. It's not a big space, but it is one that has this sense of wholeness that is really precious to maintain. But of course, the layered stories of this space, both the personal one that I just gave you a taste of, but also a couple more that we're gonna chat about, I'd love to be able to unpack those for visitors. So the challenge really was how to create a space next to the Peacock Room in the attendant gallery that would give our visitors a sense of those layered stories, a way to access this room beyond just the experience of that pure aesthetic pleasure. So the aim of the exhibition really was to do that. It was also to use, as I mentioned, our very deep collection of Whistlers to be able to tell that story, to get many of them that haven't been up on the walls, up on the walls. We're also about to be celebrating the 150th anniversary of this space in 2026 and 27, so the opportunity also to showcase the work's origins, to celebrate its existence and its continuity in our spaces was an exciting opportunity for me. As you'll see at the end as well, this was also a chance to showcase an exciting new acquisition for the museum. So I was lucky enough to start my thinking on this process with a day and a half of what we called a think tank. So this was sponsored by a wonderful association of folks called Chipstone. If anyone's been to Milwaukee, that's where they're based, and they have a relationship with the Milwaukee Museum. But they essentially fund incubation sessions for largely American decorative arts, but they give you totally carte blanche. So I had the opportunity to bring together a whole group of thinkers, some of them art historians, some of them museum technology specialists, and a couple of them contemporary working artists. So you see here the work of Stephanie Saihuko on the left, Beatrix Glow on the right. These are both young Asian American artists, and they had really different and really interesting takes on how we could unpack stories about the Peacock Room and tell new stories. Specifically, I'll point you over here to Beatrix's work. This was recently up at the New York Historical Society. So Beatrix takes works from permanent collections, historic objects. In some cases, she's remaking them, reshaping them. In some cases, she's largely acting as a curator, but to kind of really reorient how you're thinking about provenance, how works have come together, and she's asking you to really be a little more critical in the assessment of how museums acquire what they acquire and why we're presenting things the way they are. So these were voices that were really welcome for me as I was beginning to get my head around how we might tell new stories about the Peacock Room. So as I've been getting at, this is a room with layered meanings. So I essentially thought that we might break it down really along three kind of lines. There is the kind of tensions inherent in that personal story. There are the larger stakes of an artistic conflict that is within Whistler and also with the art world at large at this moment. And then there's the question about global exchange and power relationships at this moment as well, as Whistler is incorporating and utilizing aspects of Asian art and culture at this point in this European context. So it was those three layers that I was really thinking about unpacking more fully within the context of the show. And we can go to the next one. I don't blame it, this is a good one. That's perfect. And I'll say too, just for the context of the presentation, any of these of my little bottom things will, if they are in white, they are part of the permanent collection, and most often part of the exhibition. If you see one of these in blue, that means that I'm using it for illustration, but it is not part of the collection. So to get into a little bit of that first layer, these personal histories, we in our collection have this wonderful opportunity to talk about, before this conflict, before this rupture, this particularly close-knit relationship that Whistler has with Frederick Leyland, who is his primary patron over a decade and the owner of the Peacock Room. Our collection really offers us this opportunity to see Whistler as he's developing this relationship, to see the intimacy that Whistler enjoys with both Leyland as well as his family. So I'll ask for the next slide. To showcase a wonderful grand manner portrait that we have of Frederick Leyland in the collection that you're seeing here on the left. This is an important moment in Leyland's career. Like Whistler, Leyland comes from a relatively modest background. So he's coming up in the world from essentially a middle-class life in Liverpool. He, through his acumen in business, has taken over a relatively large shipping company and has bought himself a beautiful home in the Liverpool environs, but decides he wants to make his splash in London society. So the second home he purchases, 49 Prince's Gate, is the one that will house the Peacock Room. But it's during that presentation of himself as a cultured aesthete in London that Whistler paints Arrangement in Black, the portrait of F.R. Leyland. No wonder that Leyland is interested and invested in presenting himself very much in the mode of a Habsburg. So here we see one of Whistler's real icons and loves, Diego Velázquez. Here he's painted Philip IV, but you can see the resonances, of course, between these two types of artists. Though they're disparate in time, Whistler idolizes Velázquez, and he's looking very much to that sense of a presence of a darkly clad figure, certainly that very pared down background from which that figure emerges, as well as those beautiful subtle touches at the wrists as well as up at the collar that accentuate that seriousness of purpose in the face. So Whistler's looking to Velázquez as he is painting this portrait of Leyland, who is very much invested in coming out, presenting himself in a very particular way to London society. At the same moment, I should say, part of the impetus for purchasing 49 Prince's Gate is to hold Leyland's growing collection of art. So like many cultured men of his moment, he's collecting the old masters, but he's also making friends with the contemporary artists of his moment. So that means Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and Rossetti is of course the one who famously introduces him to Whistler, and Leyland then becomes the one of Whistler's real primary patrons, is financing much of the work that Whistler is doing, commissions as well, portrait commissions as well as other types of work, as we'll see. So I show you here the home in Liverpool that Leyland purchases, and to give you a sense that Whistler is developing this relationship even before.
You rented it, you didn't buy it.
You're right. The home that he rents outside of Liverpool Speak Hall. And to give you a sense too of the intimacy that Whistler and his mother are also enjoying in spaces like this, I show you this wonderful etching over here on the right that likely visualizes Francis Leyland on the approach to Speak Hall. So they are frequent visitors at this space. And I show you here a contemporary view of 49 Prince's Gate, as well as a view of the interior parlor. Leyland purchases this, as I mentioned, because he has this growing collection of art that he's interested in putting more fully out into the fore. It's a rather sort of staid exterior, but as you can see, a lavish interior to showcase this collection. One of the wonderful works that he has purchased from Whistler around this time is the famous Princess from the Land of Porcelain. So this is a work that has pride of place in the dining room that will become the Peacock Room. So you see the Princess from the Land of Porcelain here on the left, as well as a rendering of what the original space would have looked like in the dining room when Thomas Jekyll has begun his renovation of that space in order to turn it into a space to display Leyland's collection of blue and white porcelains. But of course, before, Whistler has had the opportunity to paint over this antique Spanish wall covering that will become a key friction point in this space. So this was a type of wall covering that was highly prized, highly expensive, but also recommended to show off not only the blue and white porcelain, but also to harmonize with the Princess from the Land of Porcelain. But before we get too far into the dining room, I do want to show you the kind of first commission that Whistler has within 49 Prince's Gate. And these are the panels moving up this grand staircase in this London townhouse. We are really lucky in our collection to have a large number of these panels, and they're fantastic because they give you a sense of the opulence of this space, but also because we can actually see Whistler working out many of the ideas that we will then subsequently see him bring to gorgeous fruition in the Peacock Room itself. So Whistler, as many of you know, is essentially an innovator in any media that he touches. That extends very much so into his forays into decoration on domestic spaces. So for this, what he's actually done is use very thin sheets of imitation gold leaf, and you can see them as the kind of squares that are extending across the background of this. He's then laid essentially a semi-transparent paint glaze on top of that, and then done some sort of carving away in order to let some of that luminescence, that interior glow come through. So that is a technique that we will see him play with again when he gets to the dining room and in our collection, what you're able to see here. He's also used then a stylized motif of morning glories. And I love this so much because what better flower, something that just organically creeps and crawls its way up something, what better flower to select in order to have these staircase panels that are individually sized to make that way up the staircase. It's just perfect, it is beautiful. And it's a way in which we can see him very much making some of these initial ideas sort of play out. So our collection is also this wonderful opportunity for us to see Whistler very much at home with not just Frederick, painting grand manner portraits, but also very much with the larger Leyland family. So our collection is rich in works on paper. I would give my right arm to have Mrs. Leyland. Unfortunately, she lives at the Frick. She's not going anywhere. But this is a finished grand manner portrait, essentially a pendant to the Frederick Leyland portrait in our collection. What we do have are a series of these gorgeous pastels, one of which you're seeing here on the left, that are studies for the eventual portrait, but that allow you to sense that these are people who are spending a great deal of time together. Frederick Leyland is often abroad, often in Liverpool, working on business affairs, and Whistler is then therefore able to spend a great deal of time with the family, with these much more private pastels, but even also transmuting some of them as models for etchings that then become more widely circulated, as you can see here in the center. It's not only Frances that Whistler becomes particularly close to, it's also the Leyland children. So we have two etchings here, one of Florence, one of Eleanor. And for my money, you really do get the sense that Whistler knows these kids. It's visible in the correspondence. He talks about his favorite Eleanor as being, quote, exasperatingly lovely. I think you very much get that sense in that stance of Eleanor here in the center. He called her Babs, and that is also who you see lovingly depicted here in this very intimate image here on the left. So I'm able to put this group of works on paper. They rotate because of concerns about exposure, but I'm able to put this group up to suggest really that when this rupture, when this tension really breaks, and that break is complete with Whistler and the family, that it's financial and it's reputational, but for Whistler it is also very personal. So a second story that we are really uniquely able to tell, and really lucky to be able to tell, are really about the artistic stakes for Whistler at this moment in his career. The Peacock Room and its production falls at a key moment where Whistler is attempting to do really nothing less than redefine the stakes of art and art practice. Never one to set low goals. He has, thanks to Leyland, some advances in order to create a commission that he calls the Three Girls. This is meant to be essentially the apotheosis of artistic practice for Whistler. It's something that he labors over constantly. It's something that we have on view in studies. So here you see three of what become known as the 6 projects. And I don't have an attendant image here to show you, but perhaps you can imagine these are a great departure from essentially the types of work that many of his peers are doing. He's certainly looking to Greco-Roman figuration. We can see that in the drapery of these figures. He's of course looking to his friend, fellow painter Albert Moore for some of these conservatory scenes. We see attendant images similar to those. But the gesture, the way that these, even though they are studies, he really was kind of thinking through the way that the brush itself could articulate movement, could articulate form. He's looking very much to Japanese prints, which he likens to embroidery in terms of seeing repeated colors of a set of tones. He sees them repeated across an image. And so he's looking to those types of forms as he's articulating this new language. For Whistler, we know famously this is about the beauty and the aesthetic appreciation of these beyond them needing to tell a story or give a moral. So all of this is tied up in the project that Whistler is trying to do as he's laboring over this work that he calls the Three Girls. And so I have 3 of these studies to really give a sense of just what Whistler is up against as he's trying to create this work that he wants to be what his mother calls, quote, the perfection of art. And just some further details to give you a sense of just how much he's playing with form, he's playing with that very gestural work. Also, of course, attending to the Japanese prints and kind of surface pattern and iconography that's going to become, again, so key as he's thinking through the Peacock Room. So the Three Girls, the canvas that is never completed, becomes, again, particularly germane to the story of the Peacock Room, because when Leyland moves to 49 Prince's Gate, it is across from the Princess of the Land of Porcelain that he, in fact, intends the Three Girls to sit. So that space itself was meant to be the space in which Whistler could showcase this apotheosis of artistic practice. This space that was meant to say everything about harmony in color and tone. And of course, what happens in the end is quite the opposite. Rather than having the Three Girls sit in that honored space across from the Princess from the Land of Porcelain, we get this monument to that rupture, to the vitriol that Whistler feels over the sense of artistic practice not being sufficiently appreciated in its space and time. One addendum also to this story that I would be remiss if I didn't share is that to add insult to injury for Whistler, Whistler had in fact designed the frame that you see here on the right, specifically for the three girls. So many of you likely know that Whistler was attendant to every detail of his canvases that often extended to the frames themselves. So Whistler had specifically painted this frame, including some beautiful music notes that you can make out somewhere, down at the bottom, I believe. And so that was meant to be part of the three girls, to frame the three girls. After this rupture takes place, Whistler, beyond art and money, paints this even crueler caricature of Leyland called the Gold Scab, Eruption and Filthy Lucre. We see Leyland here, who was famously serious as an amateur pianist, who is at his piano. He's got his frills, but he's sort of a caricature of an evil peacock in this instance. His claws, and he's of course sitting on the White House, which Whistler believes has been taken unfairly to settle the debts. Again, a work I would give my right arm to have in our collection. You can visit it in San Francisco. So my second story here is really doing some work to unravel the global stakes of Whistler's depiction. It's my third story, not my second. You're not here for too much longer. So what I wanted to do in this section was to really think through some of the larger stakes of the iconography, of the collecting practices of this moment, to introduce our visitors to some of the more vexed histories that type of collecting has in the West. So we know from Whistler's own collection, as well as his encouragement to Leyland, that Kanchi blue and white porcelain was a craze at this moment. Whistler is in fact credited with beginning this so-called craze for China mania. It is a type of porcelain that's coming out of the Jingzhen region in China and is incredibly popular at this moment. And so Leyland, like cultured men of his moment, were collecting it in large amounts and displaying it, and you can see here on the left, a period photograph of Leyland's dining room, and here on the right, the way that we have reinterpreted it here during various moments at the Freer Gallery of Art. So one of the great, again, virtues of the institution that I'm at is that we have a wonderful collection of Chinese porcelain, so I'm able to put out a selection of this blue and white porcelain. And you see here on the right, one of the works that I've selected that actually has a peacock motif running around the border of this platter, so you can see that literal one-for-one transmutation. But we also have these original pen and ink drawings that Whistler does for what becomes a published collection, a very famous Thompson collection of blue and white porcelain. So Thompson was a collector, and Whistler goes in and creates these beautiful, and we think really spontaneous pen and ink drawings to illustrate this famous collection. From what I can tell, in most instances, I don't see any pencil sketches, so I do think that it's a really fresh and direct opportunity for Whistler to just absorb what he's seeing in terms of the form, but also in terms of the detail on these types of works. So I'm able to put out a whole range of these really wonderful pen and ink studies over the course of the exhibition that give you a sense of Whistler's deep connection and deep looking into the details of these types of objects. We are also lucky to have these two fragments. So this helps us flesh out that story of the way in which Whistler's thinking about using various media to depict this type of porcelain. So these two fragments were once part of a portrait, again, what would have been a large-scale portrait of Eleanor at Leyland. They are fragmentary because after Whistler's bankruptcy, there is essentially a fire sale of his work where his creditors are able to come and collect. Whistler is very afraid at that point that Leyland, one of his creditors, will get his hands on this Eleanor Leyland portrait unfinished. And so he actually destroys the canvas, he cuts it up. Luckily for us, Thomas Way, his friend, and the man who will help him print his etchings eventually, Thomas Way rescues these two fragments. So we are lucky to have the kind of remnants of what would have been a larger portrait of Eleanor Leyland. But you see the attention and that wonderful bravura brushstroke that Whistler brings to visualizing these types of ceramics as they would have existed in that larger portrait. And I couldn't resist just including a reminder that this was not by any means the only portrait to include precious daughters alongside precious objects. So Sargent as well in his very famous Daughters of Edward Darley Boyt, which is always on view at the MFA Boston. We see here too a man of means and of status who is very much equating his precious daughters with similarly precious possessions, that blue and white porcelain. So that equivalency, I mean, in these cases, of course, they're being literally dwarfed in scale by these mammoth porcelains, but that idea of equating preciousness with preciousness is one that is working across these types of paintings. So now I will return us back into the Peacock Room and to a series of works that Whistler creates at the time that he is creating The Princess from the Land of Porcelain. So we're very lucky to have a couple of examples of these instances where Whistler is using works that he has purchased from dealers in Europe, but that have been brought from China and from Japan. So what you see here is Christina Spartale. She is a famous Anglo-Greek beauty, and she is here visualized, clad in kimono. She's holding a fan. We see the Japanese screen behind her, as well as the blue and white porcelain, what's thought to be a Chinese rug underneath her feet. Whistler had collected and amassed many of these works. We have one extant photograph from his own living spaces and studios that gives us a bit of a sense of exactly what his collection looked like. But The Princess from the Land of Porcelain, is part of a suite of works, around 5, of these Anglo-American sitters who are replete and ensconced in these spaces that have just a plethora of these types of objects. So one of my favorite works in our collection over here on the left is called Caprice in Purple and Gold, or the Golden Screen. This is one that we do have on view in the exhibition because it is part of that group of works. A chance for us to see that type of collecting that Whistler was engaged in, particularly in Purple and Gold over here on the left. You see not only those flowing draperies of this gorgeous textile of the kimono, as well as the blue and white porcelain. You see lacquer, you see a Chinese chair, as well as what we think is a screen depicting the tale of Genji behind our sitter. We imagine perhaps also that gold background that you see on these types of screens may have been part of the inspiration for Whistler as he took on that commission in the Peacock Room. Another just amazing thing I think about Whistler, the painter, is that he is able to use an economy of brushwork with just the pure color and pure gesture to be able to articulate the prints that here our sitter Joe Heffernan is looking at. So we are able not only to, from those brushstrokes, figure out that this is Hiroshige's views of the 60-odd provinces, we are able to pinpoint exactly which work from that series he is visualizing here. And it is with such economy of scale that he is able to show us that. It's a feat that constantly amazes me. But we see, as I mentioned, Whistler's preferred model of this moment, Jo Heffernan, who was his mistress as well at the time. She's visualized very much in the guise of the connoisseur. So unlike Christina Spartale, who's rather passive in her stance, We see Jo actually taking up that print to explore it, as well as the several prints arrayed at her feet that do give her a sense of activity in this space. Similarly, in the Longaleisen of the Six Marks, the third painting I would certainly give an arm or a leg for, but is at Philadelphia. We see Whistler positioning Heffernan in this instance in the guise of the artist. So we have this Anglo-British sitter who is herself actually being positioned in the context of someone who is painting these works. And it's this interesting elision, I think, between these white female sitters, but these exoticized Asian spaces that is an interesting tension that Whistler is aware of. It is not a mistake that he refers to the portrait. He names the portrait in the Peacock Room, the princess from the land of porcelain, even though it very clearly does not visualize a Chinese or Japanese sitter. And the elision and that confusion was one that was pervasive in all of the writing at that moment. So anyone who was critiquing them was talking about these sitters as if they were Chinese or Japanese. But it is, I think, that sort of uneasy tension that we see represented here that Whistler is aware of and he's understanding at this moment. That it is not, it's a convention of this moment, but it is one, I think, that gives us some pause, and also in the final second to final work in the exhibition, I think comes to a really interesting conclusion. This is one of the stars of our collection that I have on view in the exhibition. We refer to it as the balcony, but it's coincidentally also the first work of art that Charles Lang Freer, the first painting that he purchases of Whistler's. But here you see, I think, in some instances, that notion of these two worlds kind of, and their uneasiness in coming together. So what we have in the foreground are four models who are similarly arrayed in kimono. We have one playing a shamisen, which is a Japanese instrument. We have a sake set that's in front of the model who's arrayed across the balcony. Whistler's tipped the composition forward, which is both a convention of Japanese prints, but also allows us to get that color-saturated foreground. We see him beginning to experiment over here on the left with the colophon that would then become the butterfly signature that he's so famous for. We see also these almost floating series of flowers that again evoke what he's seeing in the Japanese art that he's collecting. So very much a kind of stylized and world of these bright tones, of that kind of notion of borrowing the beauty and the aesthetic grace of that type of world. Then on the top register, what is so wonderful is that because this is Whistler's balcony in Chelsea, and I now understand this with so much more immediacy than I did 4 days ago, we see him overlooking the slag heaps and the industrial centers in Battersea. So he's very aware too of the uneasiness in some ways of these two worlds in collision, in conversation. He understands as well, I think, in some ways that the industry over here, which is not, as he's seeing in his Japanese prints, a gorgeous view of Mount Fuji, it's a slag heap. What he's seeing there is the industry that generates the capital that is able to undergird the type of beauty that he is visualizing here in the foreground. So it's a wonderful work to really begin to unpack those tensions coming to a fore in a way that Whistler is visualizing for us in a work like this. So the last work in the exhibition is a new purchase for us, and I'm excited to debut it in this exhibition. And these are two plaques by Victor Brenner. Brenner, you may not think you know, but for anyone who is carrying around American currency at the moment, Brenner is the one who created the profile on the American penny of Abraham Lincoln. So in fact, we all know and love Brenner. But he was an American sculptor, but became very well known for these sort of celebrity bas-reliefs that he did. And so we were offered the opportunity to purchase this one. These are quite large. Brenner would have actually created these as smaller plaques that would have been double-sided. What I believe we have here are the originals from which those smaller plaques are being created. So a lot of museums you'll see the double-sided version of this. But these are about this big, and on one side you see that Brenner has created an image of Whistler. It's likely a composite of a couple photographs, but with all of his signature flourishes. So he's got his thin cane, we see the monocle, his tuft of hair, this beautifully draped shawl, as well as the butterfly insignia. Brenner's written James McNeill Whistler, painter, etcher, writer. And on the other side, he has created an image of the peacock at rest over here on the left. The version of the butterfly very much active here with arms or wings outstretched, and the words Monsieur les ennemis, so essentially the enemies. So this gives you a sense, these were created in 1905, so that is several years after the affair of the Peacock Room and after Whistler's death. But it allows you to see that this room, the rupture, the story, the icon, the hay that Whistler is able to make of the affair subsequently to gain himself celebrity, this comes across the pond to the extent that this became a story that became a collector's item. So the history of this continues the story, the legend, and we're able to then visualize it in terms like this at the end of the exhibition. So that's a little bit of the taste of what you'll see. Hopefully you'll come visit us and see the show. But I'm happy to take questions, and again, thank you so much for having me. The balcony is maybe 3 feet by 4 feet. It's not enormous.
Is that oil or is it?
Yeah, it's in oil. Mm-hmm.
Is the paint, the blue paint, still original, or have you restored it?
In the Peacock Room?
Yes.
It is. We've done 2 major conservation efforts in the Peacock Room. So we did a major one in the 90s, which had it closed for 3 years. And that was one of those, Sistine ceiling kind of situations where we got, decades of grime off and it sparkled in this unbelievable new way. We did another restoration in 2022, and that was much more minor, but a kind of overall cleaning of the space and an opportunity to ensure, so those wonderful shutters actually open into these beautiful, perfect pockets. And one Thursday every month, we do actually open the shutters, so you can see that room in natural light, which, not surprisingly, it kind of changes the feel of that space completely. So it's a really special thing to do, but that conservation effort was specifically so we could do that much more seamlessly.
So the gold, is it a blue or sort of green? What's the...
It is both. It is all.
It looked a bit confusing. I couldn't quite figure it out from the photographs. You see the actual colour of the back, on the main wall. The shelves obviously are gold, but the actual...
Yeah, I mean it depends on which substrate we're talking about, because we've got wooden wainscoting along the bottom. Yeah. We have canvas along that kind of center area, and then at least on the back wall we again have that antique leather that Whistler paints over. Yeah. So it totally depends on which kind of piece. There are instances where he is using that imitation gold leaf that's along the shutters, and then painting that semi-transparent. It's very much a turquoise, so it's a blue-green. But there are spaces when he's going over the leather that tone becomes much bluer. But there are other instances where one can feel a green. I mean, he's experimenting across the entire room as a canvas. he's perennially painting and repainting, scraping and redoing things. So it is it's similar to the way he approaches his canvases. So he does them, he's unhappy with them, he does them again. And even after this whole fight has taken place, Leyland leaves, and with the presumption that Whistler will finish the job, and he essentially goes back and does almost every surface again. So constantly reworking. But yeah, I mean, when you come, you'll see it's sort of different depending on what vantage point you're looking at.
Do you see any parallels between Whistler and Singer Sargent? And apart from the fact they're both Americans, but I mean, the sort of preoccupation with colour and fabrics. I mean, as you know, Singer Sargent used to, if there wasn't an appropriate dress, he would wrap his model up in whatever it happened to be. And he had cases of these fabrics which he used to use. But I think the sort of the colour, the violent, terrific, exciting colours, and also the obsession with black seem to be parallels between both. Do you find that?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think they're two artists who are beyond their status as expatriates, have wonderful confluences to explore. I mean, what's particularly interesting to me as well is that they're both doing their share, I mean, Sargent more than Whistler, but of these high society portraits and hobnobbing in these elite spaces, but they are both also paying very close attention to working class subjects. So for Sargent, it's the bead stringers in Venice. For Whistler, it's a whole range of working class folks who are in London, who are in Venice, who are in Amsterdam, but it's that capacity, I think, to move between spaces with facility. It's unusual in that moment to have that kind of, to look beyond a kind of surface image of those working class, particularly female subjects that I think they also share, and that has actually been relatively unexamined. Yeah.
Do you know how long did this sort of Japanism craze last? Because Whistler's paintings are presumably at the sort of front end of it. It's 1860s and 1870s, but it seems to have lasted into the 1890s. I mean, you've got the Mikado, in late 1880s, early 1890s, which was inspired in part by a Japanese exhibition in London. I always thought it was a much shorter period, but it seems to have gone on for quite a while.
Yeah, I mean, I think the interest in it, yes, I think you can see a fairly long durée. I mean, there's a fairly easy sort of starting point, which of course is when Japan sort of officially opens or is opened to the West, and the flood of goods kind of goes from a trickle to a much wider movement of materials. But it's a fascination of Frears who's collecting into the early 20th century. I think the big difference becomes, in many instances, it's not merely the kind of few importers, and it's not just the nexuses who are accruing these objects and then dissipating a very particular set of materials to a particular set of patrons, but the opportunity for folks like Freer to actually travel themselves to Japan, and that's when you see a kind of wider opening of the kind of range of materials that are coming in from beyond a sort of rather select few types. But I mean, of course, yeah, you're gonna see it across quite a long time span.
How did Freer get to know about the Peacock Room and then get so obsessed with it that he took the whole thing over to America?
I love this story. I mean, it's through, so when Leyland dies, 49 Prince's Gate goes to a woman named Blanche Watney, who for some reason decides that she doesn't want this to be her dining room. So she ends up working with a firm called Obach in order to sell the space. And they're looking for buyers. And Freer has offered it, and initially he actually declines. It is much more, it's much gaudier than what we understand Freer's taste really to have been by and large. But it's at that time, it's shortly after Whistler's death, and I think Freer understands his role as essentially the perpetuator of Whistler's reputation, particularly in the United States. But he comes around and he decides, at first he says, fine, I'll consider one of the window panels. But he does eventually come around, but there's all of this wonderful, because this is such a well-known sort of celebrity space, there are these wonderful articles speculating on who, it leaks that it's an American who's purchased it, and there are these wonderful articles that were speculating on whether sort of which wealthy American has purchased it. And so Freer eventually, yes, he I think understands that it has this outsized importance in understanding Whistler as an artist. So he creates a purpose-built space for it in his Detroit mansion. It subsequently then becomes, he populates it not with blue and white porcelain, which is very much not to his taste, but with works from across China, Japan, Korea, the Middle East, Syria, and it becomes very much his laboratory for understanding his own theory of aesthetics, which is very much influenced by Whistler.
A slightly connected question. 49 Princess Gate, you mentioned some of those panels on the staircase which you have. Is there anything left of the original decorative scheme in the house?
In the house today? I don't know. If anyone knows the owners of 49 Princess Gate, it would be a pleasure.
When you look at the design and layout of the room, a couple of things strike me. The very ornate ceiling and the lighting system that's there. And how much did Whistler influence the design of that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean,
Secondly,
oh, sorry.
The second piece of it is the white and blue of the china is a real juxtaposition with the colouring of the room, and it almost jars. And so how did, I guess, what was the scope of works, the brief for Whistler by Leyland to say this is what I like?
Yes, both great questions. So to your first question about the ceiling specifically, so Whistler has nothing to do with the essential architecture of the space. So if you, so these wonderful kind of drops have that kind of Tudor-esque styling to them. If you recall the black and white image I showed you of one of the parlors or the drawing rooms of the library in 49 Princess Gate, you see that that is actually the genius of Thomas Jekyll, who was the decorator before Whistler, who gets very short shrift in this story. He's actually a marvelous and really fantastic decorator in his own right, but he's the one to develop that scheme of the lights that kind of almost drop like stalactites from the ceiling. So Whistler has nothing to do with the kind of skeleton of that, but it is his innovation to create those repeating peacock breast feather patterns that then adorn the ceiling. So that's the piece that he adds to that. And sorry, remind me of your second question.
The juxtapositioning of the
yes.
blue and white and china against the colour scheme you see.
Yeah, I think we have to suspend our own understanding of what goes well together and put our minds in the 1870s. Briefly, just to say that I think there was an appetite for pattern on pattern on pattern that we might not necessarily espouse in our day and age. That's one bit. But also, I mean, as to the brief was a few light alterations. So Jekyll was meant to complete this work. It was meant to include that prominent Spanish leather that was in shades of pink and yellow. And initially, Whistler does his darndest to just go into the flowers to make some changes there. So the initial idea for Whistler is that he's unhappy with not how the blue and white is working, but indeed how the Princess from the Land of Porcelain is working with that Spanish leather. And so the idea of kind of these alterations, they get more and more expansive. But But really, I think too, that kind of sense of this relationship, like throughout the correspondence, you see him writing to Leyland with the supposition that this is going to be a lovely surprise, that Leyland is going to be so delighted by what he's been able to complete. So the fact that Leyland is not anything but overjoyed is really a complete surprise to Whistler when Leyland comes and is displeased with the degree to which these alterations have been made. But the brief is for a few light changes. The brief is to help Jekyll, who has become ill, to kind of finish the job.